Trigger warnings, microaggression, safe spaces, these are terms that are now common on many college campuses, and they're intended to protect students from undue harm. But our guest today says these efforts are misguided and have a negative impact on freedom of speech. Greg Lukianoff is a First Amendment lawyer and the president and CEO of the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education, known by the acronym FIRE, which aims to protect the right of free speech on college campuses. Greg is a prolific author. He's written for numerous publications, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and many, many others. He's also testified before both the US Senate and the House of Representatives about free speech issues on America's college campuses. He famously co-authored a best-selling book with John Haidt of the Heterodox Academy, and the book is titled The Coddling of the American Mind: How Good Intentions and Bad Ideas Are Setting Up a Generation for Failure. Man, what a title. So Dan and I are delighted to chat with Greg today and hear his thoughts on free speech at college campuses and why this is important to all of us, even those of us not on college campuses. So thank you so much and welcome to the Unbiased Show, Greg.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
How widespread is this problem of policing of speech on college campuses? Is this kind of it happens in some sectors in liberal arts colleges, or is it across a lot of non-liberal arts colleges too?
It's across colleges. And the funny thing is, I specialized in First Amendment law in law school. I worked at the ACLU of Northern California while I interned there in my last year. I took every class that Stanford offered on freedom of speech. When I ran out of them, I did 6 credits on censorship during the Tudor dynasty, because this is my passion. And even in 2001, when I joined FIRE, I was shocked at how easy it was to get in trouble for what you said on campus. It was already less free than I would have thought. But I will say that since 2020, I have never seen a situation so bad for free speech on campus in my entire career. Since around 2020, for the last 2 years, I've seen more attempts to get professors fired. I've seen more professors flat out fired. We've had more case submissions from students all over the country. And this is remarkable, particularly that more professors are getting in trouble, because viewpoint diversity has been going steadily down since I started in 2001. So you would think that at this level of homogeneity that there wouldn't be all that many professors left to get rid of. But wow, it's been scary.
You had mentioned before we hit record that there were somewhere in the neighborhood of, 30 tenured professors? Yeah. Tenured professors who were fired.
Since 2015.
And also, to help the person listening wrap their head around this, why should they care? Like, why should they be so concerned about free speech on what is arguably a contained area?
Certainly a lot of reasons, but not the least of which is that higher education, American higher education, plays an outsized role in how we know what the world actually looks like. It trains our journalists, it trains our public servants, and it also creates the expert class that's supposed to be able to accurately and faithfully sort of report to us like what their research finds. And when freedom of speech and academic freedom is threatened, it undermines, and I wish the experts themselves would understand this to a degree, they're not going to trust you to say anything that's not considered to be already popular on campus. So, and this is one of the things that I keep on pointing out. It's like, okay, so if, a professor can actually be fired, for saying, let's take the early COVID, when they were saying that people shouldn't wear masks because they don't actually protect you for like those first couple months. And someone comes out and says the opposite, but gets in trouble for it. Are you really going to trust people to be able to take that opposite point of view? Because if you can literally get fired for saying the wrong thing in the expert class at the moment, or in higher education, why should you trust people to be unbiased? The fact that viewpoint diversity has gone down so much in higher ed among the professors is very troubling. But one thing that I hadn't seen up until the past couple of years were demands that scholarly papers be retracted. This doesn't happen all that often, but the fact that it happens at all for ideological reasons, when the argument isn't that this is wrong or shoddy or incorrect, that people are withdrawing papers in some cases because there was one study that the authors withdrew it after conservatives were, like Heather McDonald, were citing it as evidence for the argument that, well, she wouldn't put it this way, but I put it this way: the police shoot too many people, period, and that the discrepancy on race is not as important. Now, she played up the idea that the discrepancy on race, was the whole story. And as far as people like me and Steve Pinker are concerned, it's like, no, that's a horrifyingly large number of people who are getting shot in the first place. But that paper was withdrawn partially because it was the wrong people were citing it. And that leaves people in the public to be like, so if someone comes to a research conclusion that's contrary to what we'd like it to be in higher ed, they just withdraw it? Like, why should I trust anything you say after that?
It might help listeners understand some specific case examples. So you've talked about 30 tenured professors getting fired for
Yeah.
ideological reasons. Now, I didn't even know that tenured professors could be fired. I thought that was the whole point of tenure. Unless you break a criminal law or some other law, I thought you're there for as long as you are living. How did this happen? How can you get fired for saying the wrong thing if you're tenured?
The protection just over time, they figured out ways around it. One of the early cases where they were trying to get a tenured professor fired, it was actually an attack coming from the right. This was a professor named, his last name was Guth, I believe. I forgot what his first name was. But he was at Kansas State University, and he tweeted after the Newtown massacre something that, as a parent, I can understand why people would react negatively to this, but nonetheless, saying, "May it be your kids next time, NRA." Because he was, outraged that this horrifying thing managed to happen. And, he was tenured and, he got forced out. And that was one of the first times I'd seen a situation where someone really went after a tenured professor. And now it's gotten relatively commonplace. So commonplace, though, by the way, that in the Netflix drama, the Sandra Oh drama, The Chair, they even say this. It's like tenure isn't perfect protection anymore. Like, you can get fired for what you say, for what you teach, for what your research finds. And by the way, we have this whole list of the we call it the Scholars Under Fire database at thefire.org. You can look at this information yourself. It's been interesting watching. I wrote a very long piece with Comey German, who works for Fire, about cancel culture, particularly on campus, and talking about like how stark the numbers are. And it's amazing till this day. We're hitting about 600 attempts. I think we actually probably just passed 600 attempts to get professors fired. The reason why we're focusing on professors is that's comparatively easy to find, because when a professor gets in trouble, that usually will produce like a student newspaper article, for example. Mm-hmm. It's much harder to track down when it's students. And I'd say about 2/3 of those have happened just since 2020, or at least 2019. So it's been a big uptick in that way. Also, about 2/3 of those result, the professor gets in trouble in some way, and about 1/5 of them, they get fired. I really do want to point out, this is a situation where professors are already saying that they watch what they say, and that there isn't a great deal of viewpoint diversity to begin with, that professors are still, being knocked out of higher ed at a rate that I have never previously seen in my career.
What do you think about the counter to that, though, which is that this might just be people complaining about being called out for bigotry and other socially inappropriate remarks?
That argument is flippant and dismissive, and it usually comes from people who haven't actually looked into it. Mm-hmm. And it's very funny watching this kind of like little constellation of arguments that people make, that kind of like, so they don't have to listen to it anymore. The first one is whataboutism, and this is something that the left and the right both do, where it's like, well, this other thing happened, so who cares about this thing? It's like, well, first of all, there's nothing logically inconsistent with this bad thing happened, so you shouldn't care about this thing is nonsensical to begin with, and largely sort of a distraction. There are plenty of cases when professors are called out. Professors are called out on a regular basis. One of the things that changed, though, pretty much, and I count the date around 2014. That's one of the things we talk about in Coddling the American Mind, where it went from "how dare you, professor," or "I totally disagree," or protesting, outside on campus and demanding that professor be fired. It wasn't as if it never happened prior to 2014 that people demanded professors get fired for what they said, but there was a huge uptick in the demands that they get fired, and a real fundamental misunderstanding of, if you really disagree with the professor, then write a paper about it, then write an op-ed about it, then challenge it with research. You don't just immediately go to this person needs to be fired. So really, like, the argument overwhelmingly, for when people just say, oh, this is just people who don't like to be criticized, it's like, oh, these are people who don't like to be fired from their job for doing their job in a system that we rely on to help us understand what the world really looks like.
My mind is being blown by some of this stuff, because I'm thinking back to when I was in college and never even.
When did you graduate?
A long time ago, 1999.
Oh, wow. Yeah, I graduated in 96. We were lucky enough to go to college during a time where I'd say from about 85 to 95 is what I call the first great age of political correctness, because this is when Scholars, started getting speech codes passed on campus, and this is when there was like a real outrage off campus that this was happening, and professors were having their jobs threatened, but nowhere near the scale that's happening today, by the way. Keep in mind, this was 20 years after the start of the free speech movement in Berkeley in 1964, and only 10 years after you started having these real victories in the Supreme Court for collegiate student free speech. Just in less than 10 years, they were passing speech codes. These were unpopular in the New York Times, the New York Post, and they got defeated roundly every single time they were challenged in court because they were also unconstitutional. And it seems like after 95, some of the like sort of hot passion for we're going to, through enlightened censorship, create a better world, it kind of died off a little bit. And PC became a joke. Talking to people even 6 years later, like, oh yeah, people went through this crazy period when they thought, censorship would save us. But what happened during that period was that it wasn't strong with the administrators, and professors kind of fell out of love with the idea that we can enlighten censorship will save us. But the administrators themselves kept on churning out these speech codes. So my career starts in 2001. During that time, close to when you graduated, during that time, students were great on free speech. Students got free speech, and professors were really quite good. Administrators, much more skeptical, but generally less ideological. Like they were oftentimes going after people, because they made the school look bad. So, and honestly, like sometimes ideologically as well. So from 2001 to 2013 students were great on free speech reliably. I took it for granted. I kind of assumed that students would always be great on free speech because they get offensive lyrics, they get, edgy content, they get, racy shows. Like they get the idea that you don't have a right not to be offended. And that changed like lightning hit right around 2014. And for the first time in my career, I was seeing students demanding new speech codes, demanding people being fired, demanding conformity. And it's such a contrast to when you look at the 1960s, when you look at the movements of student rights in the 1960s, it was all, you're not our parents, you should have less power and less say over us. Meanwhile, the more recent version of it is like, we want power to have more power because we think that will work out for us, which is, from a civil liberties perspective, not the safest bet.
What happened in 2014 that you think is driving this change?
Coddling the American Mind, the entire book with my friend Jonathan Haidt, is trying to figure out what was so different, because like I said, it wasn't subtle. So in the book, we talk about things that include paranoid parenting. And to be clear, and this is very important given the economic class that I was raised in, that when we're talking about the kind of students in Coddling the American Mind, we're mostly talking about the kind of students who go to some of these elite colleges. And that tends to be overwhelmingly concentrated, honestly, in not just the top quarter, but even the top 10 and 1%. And the problems faced by people in the bottom 50%, completely different and very serious, but very different at the same time. So one of the things we talk about is paranoid parenting. For upper class parents seem to get much more scared even as things got safer. We talked about lack of free play, and I'm going with the more obscure ones first. That one's one that really surprised us. That lack of time to just sort of interact with your friends on your own undermines a sense of autonomy, which can be bad for mental health. Why campuses, hyper bureaucratization of universities, the things you're paying for in your tuition dollars are overwhelmingly more administrators, not more and better professors. And then, of course, what conservatives always want me to say is new ideas of social justice, which is absolutely true, that there was a change, but how that got there is something we didn't actually address in the book. But I will say the biggest thing that we can point to that seems to make perfect sense, and the research does seem to support this with some amount of controversy, is social media. That essentially the major change between people showing up in 2013, 2014 on campus versus people showing up in 2011, 2012 is these are people who have grown up in the online social media environment all the time. And this really plays havoc with the way you argue, the way you think to a degree. And I've started likening it to the way people act when in real life, when they think no one's watching, and the way people act when they feel like they're on the camera. And I think that even though you would think we'd be much more dishonest with each other, much less when no one's watching, and I'm sure that there's some of that, When people are playing to the camera, it undermines interpersonal trust. It leads to a style of argumentation in which, a lot of grandstanding. It gives people who are a little bit more ruthless a lot more power in social situations. And also, frankly, the fact that this was hitting, people when they were in junior high school, some of those junior high school tactics for hurting the people that you're rivals with made it into the larger society. So it's like some of these bad habits for the nasty ways we argue on social media, cultivated since childhood, they ended up getting to some degree on campus. We also connect the plummeting mental health of younger people partially with this phenomena as well. And I think about it, one, they are constantly being told in various ways that they're less resilient than they are, that they'll be permanently harmed by words. And all of these things can become a self-fulfilling prophecy. But there's also the fact that, you try to be like optimistic and not anxious at all when you've been in a situation your whole life where at any minute some dumb thing you said a couple of years ago, even taken entirely out of context, can ruin your academic career, can ruin your future planning. I mean, I think all of us would agree. Like, I'm glad, I'm thrilled, in fact, that social media wasn't around when I was in high school.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I graduated from college around the same time, and I generally like to think of social media around. I would have been canceled by October of my freshman year. I want to jump back to something you said, though, because as I was going through your work, the big question I had is this as much an issue of class as it is
yeah.
anything else? Because I feel like most of the instances I hear are these elite institutions.
Yeah. I think an awful lot of the culture war is much more about class than anything else. And I think one of the things that's funny about I talk about this in the long Daily Beast article that I co-wrote with Comey German about the sort of historic anti-elitism of the U.S. And now, if you look at the people who dominate Twitter, it's the 2% of the 2% and it tends to be very much more driven by elite, educated pundits. And for some reason, in that environment, being told by your betters the way to talk goes over in a way that it never would have at any previous time in American history. Now, most people don't graduate from college. We're still at about 30% of the population graduating from college. A much more sizable portion of the population goes to college, but oftentimes for shorter degrees or doesn't complete. So you're talking already about, probably the upper 20% of the economic pie to begin with. But when you're talking about the elite schools, it gets smaller and smaller to a level that actually makes me uncomfortable. Like I went from, working at Burlington Coat Factory. I actually got fired from Burlington Coat Factory and Friendlies and Sbarro's and construction and all this stuff in high school. And then I get to Stanford, for law school. And I'm like, I got to see people arguing about these two institutions I'd never heard of before, Andover and Exeter. And I was like, this is the conspiracy everyone was talking about. Like I've never heard of these things. What is an Andover? And it turns out that a disproportionate number of my classmates went to this very elite boarding school, and they still had strong feelings about people who joined in the freshman year or people who were transfers in their sophomore year. I'm like, this is gross. A lot of this is about class, in my opinion. When it comes to different kinds of schools that people attend, yes, when the heavy ideology is much more concentrated at the top, but it is filtering down. And I think that's in part because K through 12, it is all educated, on campus, and some of these norms kind of permeate the society that way. I also think that the ways of arguing that are made popular on campus are the selfish meme that essentially, like, they're so effective at winning arguments without actually making an argument that they became very popular in this environment of trying to one up each other in 140 characters. But for schools that have a better sort of class, like that have more working class people there and are just larger, we see less of these ideological issues. Not none, but we see less of it. That's not to say, however, that free speech is just fine at these schools. In those situations, the kind of cases that you'll see are the ones that I'd call as like the Dean Wormer, like as old as time situation, where an administrator wants peace and quiet on their watch. They want everybody to go to the free speech zone, a real thing. They're regulating things from a much more sort of authoritarian perspective. And oftentimes it's still the administrators who are the ones who are the bad actors, and the students are still at least comparatively good. The heavy ideology is more concentrated in elite higher ed, but it does seem to be filtering down as well.
Let's take the example of the University of California system. So this is a state school system here in California and has amazing institutions, but being a state school, I would hope is maybe slightly more accessible than, the private schools of the world.
Yeah.
And in your article, you said that they have a list of microaggressions that include the following two phrases. One, America is the land of opportunity. And two, I believe the most qualified person should get the job. Why are these considered offensive? And is that still the case in the UC system?
I'm not totally sure. I think that's still policy in UC, but I'd have to double check that. It saved UC policy for a long time. I know at least that much. And it's kind of funny. Like if you were to talk to people on campus, they would I think a lot of them would immediately be like, well, that implies that, American society is fair and therefore is offensive to people who haven't risen as fast. And it's interesting because this is where I think some of the classism comes in to a degree, because I'm a first generation American. Both my parents are immigrants. And the idea that these are things that you could say with some amount of pride, if pushed, it's like, do you think it's always fair? It's like, well, of course I don't think it's always fair. I'm not a simpleton. I actually get that it can be complicated, but it definitely has, historically at least, America, the reason why people come here to a degree is because they consider that there's a chance for a better life here. And it isn't inherently offensive unless you really try hard to make it inherently offensive. And this is what drives me crazy about microaggressions, is that I actually think microaggressions are a wonderful topic for academic study. The way in which we slight each other, the way in which we hurt each other's feelings, the way in which we dismiss each other, sometimes without even knowing it, is absolutely worthwhile. My mom's British, my father's Russian. They're microaggressing each other all the time. I'm actually a surprisingly polite person, like for a First Amendment defender, but I'm very aware of the way that you slight people. So it's very worth studying. And I think it's even worth making clear that people can be insulting. I remember actually one time in law school when I was in bad financial straits, someone gave me this like, well, just ask your parents for money. I'm like, I'm sending money home. Like I don't know. So like that would be considered kind of a microaggression. So I'm okay with being aware of it, but there are two things. One, as soon as it becomes a policy, it very quickly starts looking like whatever the preferred political point of view of the administrator who wrote the policy would like it to be. So apparently on UC saying that America's land of opportunity is something that some administrator finds particularly, outrageous. But the other one is, and this is a little bit more serious, there's something really messed up about telling people that we now know for a fact they're hitting higher ed with much higher rates of depression, much higher rates of anxiety, much higher rates of suicide and self-harm, and to tell them, by the way, sweat the small stuff. People are against you, and they're going to say things that may sound just fine, but they're actually their way of saying that they're hostile to you, that they don't think you belong here, all this kind of stuff. Where it's like telling people to be paranoid and then be wondering why they're so anxious.
Fascinating.
A lot of people on the conservative side would argue that academia has been left-leaning for decades, and this is just the natural byproduct of this continuing trend of groupthink. Do you think there's merit to that argument?
Sure. I mean, it's one of those things that if people say there's nothing wrong with having a faculty that's too politically homogenous, I think if they say, no, that's so totally fine, they're not being honest with themselves. I mean, I'm political liberal. It's one of these things where it's like, believe it or not. But at the same time, the people who would really be persuaded by that argument, I'm not all that interested in reaching anyway. But I do feel like you need to say this at this point. But yeah. And this was something that was interesting working with Haidt, is that, 50 years ago, the liberal to conservative ratio in faculty was around 2-1. Now it's about 5-1, with departments that are 30-1, like 1-0, literally like ones where they don't actually have anybody who's conservative. And I remember this with some amount of shame when I was in law school, because it's someone arguing. It's like, that author, you don't have to read that. That's conservative. That was a compelling argument to me. And I remember actually there was a student in my class, very lefty, a gay activist, but he was the one who was kind of like, well, just because something's conservative doesn't mean it's wrong. And I was like scandalized by it. and I'm ashamed of this fact. But when you have a community that's too homogenous in its politics, it's very easy to start seeing anybody outside of that as not just people you disagree with, but stupid and evil. And I think that the lack of actually, it leads to groupthink, it leads to all these other problems. And my friend Jonathan Haidt, he's trying to, with Heterodox Academy, trying to make it okay to talk about viewpoint diversity. And I think that there are a lot of receptive people out there, but the problem in that sense seems to only be getting worse.
It's interesting. The stuff that you said about social media is resonating. Actually, two things. First, overprotective parents. That comment really resonated, and it makes me feel good that I bought my son a skateboard for his 10th birthday now. I feel like I did my little part and
Good
go
job.
out there and
I'm an anxious parent. I always try to be very clear about this. And I wanted to have this a lot more in the book, where it's kind of like, listen, I'm not giving this advice about you letting your kids take risks because I naturally don't care. I'm an anxious parent. My wife has to remind me of my values all the time when I'm like, I don't know if they should go up those steep stairs. It's not easy.
yeah,
But at the same time, and this is what I'm trying to really get into people's heads. Think about it this way. Imagine whispering into your kid's ear, I don't think you can really handle this on your own. Does that feel good? Does that feel
yeah.
empowering? Does that make you less scared? No.
Mhm. That's great. I like that. I like that analogy. On the social media bit, I think is really fascinating because I think most people have a sense that social media is bad now, net
Yeah.
bad maybe, but you're tying social media into what's happening with free speech on campuses and
Yeah.
sort of how there's a generation being trained on this is how to argue and win points in the public sphere. Therefore, you could take this offline as well and do this in college. I don't think I
Yeah.
ever connected the dots before. So I find that very interesting. Dan and I, our last show actually was with Mark Cuban, who's great. And Mark says very bluntly, social media is performance art. Period. End of story. That was his exact quote. He is like,
Wow.
let's just call it for what it is. That's what
That's
we're
great.
all performers. We are all playing for the camera and the likes. It's ridiculous.
And here
Um,
I thought that was a somewhat original take, but yeah, that's a really cool way to think about it. And people just act in a nasty way when they think everyone's looking. And when I talked about this interpersonal trust dynamic too, because the kind of safe space that I'm the most enthusiastic about was what we used to mean by safe space in the 1990s. And when people said it's okay, it's a safe space, what they meant in the 90s was, listen, we're going to talk about some dark shit here, and it's okay, like you may have come from an abusive home, you may have had racist parents, like all of this kind of difficult stuff to dredge up, and it's going to stay in here and we're not going to judge you for it. That's a beautiful way of being human to each other, but it's completely undermined if you say something really difficult and someone's like, boop, 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 here you
yeah.
go. And the extent to which social media has changed our interpersonal dynamics I think it really is quite dramatic. And meanwhile, like I still have some amount of techno-optimist left in me. I actually believe that we might be in that period after the printing press where you went from having dozens of people able to talk to each other to hundreds of people to millions of people being able to talk to each other thanks to the press, or at least a one-way conversation, to suddenly having billions of people able to talk both ways to each other. Of course, that's going to be extremely disruptive.
Yeah.
And the printing press, of course, resulted in an increase in the witch trials because
Yeah.
the popular handbook for the witch trials was very popular. The 200 years of religious war. But ultimately, it also led to the scientific revolution. It led to all these other really positive things. So I think that people who are trying to fix social media right now are people who are tried to like Henry VIII, trying to ban. He didn't try to ban printing presses. He tried to license everything that came out of it. And so in 1521, that he really tried to clamp down on the printing press. It's not going to work. We can come up with better ways to deal with social media. We can come up with better algorithms potentially, but there's no way this is going to stop being incredibly disruptive. But just like with the printing press led to a situation where you could have an argument, you could put it in a codex, send it out to 1 million people, and then suddenly, this genius you never heard of is writing it back, going, "Actually, I think you should have carried the one."
Yeah.
You got something
Yeah.
slightly
Yeah.
wrong here. So
Yeah.
so the expansion of like the collective brain that we have, it just gets much bigger, and with billions of people, there is a potential. There is real positive potential here to be able to disconfirm things, to be able to sharpen ideas. But instead, we're wasting it on ad hominem arguments, which really don't get you anywhere.
I'll give you an example of maybe a technological thing that we're doing at the factual that might give you a sense of
Ooh.
there is an alternative. So at the factual, we have a very good cross section of America that uses our service. We've got CEOs that read us. We have unemployed homeless people that are subscribers. We have ex-convicts. We have pastors. It's like the grab bag of the United States, all 50 states, 3,000 zip codes. It's a real wide grab bag. Every day we conduct daily conversations on our site. And it's some poll question, and there's a yes, no, unsure sort of voting system, really easy peasy. And what's interesting is we can have very civil discussions on highly divisive topics like abortion and Roe v. Wade, which we had last week. And people are actually thoughtful and intelligent. And part of the reason is that we have changed the incentive system on how we do it compared to social media elsewhere. So the first is everyone's anonymous and your handles are dynamic. So you're not going to get fired. And because your handle changes, you're not held to everything that you've ever said in the past forever and ever. You can change your mind. It's okay. There's no counter on likes and followers. You do get votes. They're called respects, but nobody will see them except you, which means you're not voting for someone because 1,000 other people did. You're voting because you thought it was good. And so it's a better barometer of did what you say match what people care about without everyone jumping on the bandwagon. And we do these things, and the comments also are rated for insight, not for popularity. So we look at length and tone and sources, and do you read consistently versus do you just blabber a lot? And it turns out when you do all these things, you get great commentary from regular folks, not necessarily elitists, all over who have different viewpoints, and it's useful. So just a microcosm, it might be possible, some of the things that you're saying.
I would like to apologize for not having taken the time to look into this myself. This sounds exactly like what I'm arguing for, because the idea that something positive can come out of this, because initially kind of like the idea of social media being this place for, and the internet for that matter, being this place that weird people can meet each other.
That's right.
And care about it. There was real positivity to that. Like, and you look at the early days of Twitter, and it was much more people being weird for the sake of weird, or just being weird to be themselves. Then some of the tribalism and groupthink kind of took over it and became yet another place to fight out the culture war. But having the right incentives in place, Haidt would absolutely agree with you as well. Having the right incentives in place, being realistic about human motivation, concerns about status. This sounds really cool.
I am so glad you finally validated a theory I've had about the dawn of the printing press and the age of enlightenment and the Renaissance, because I've often thought about those two parallels. The fact that there was this period of immense innovation, immense, like, let's just call it political disruption, for lack of a better phrasing, happening then, and we seem to see that happening now. And of course, back then we had, as an example, Galileo under house arrest and things of that nature. It seems like the powers that be are taking that approach now. And a recent announcement was the Biden administration launching a disinformation governance board. What do you think about that effort?
So disinformation has become the new, let's call it what it is, excuse for clamping down on speech. And people that toggle their arguments for why they should clamp down on speech. And they usually alight on something that is real. Disinformation is real. There are foreign governments, particularly my dad's, I'm ashamed of my dad's people. The Russians are actually sending us disinformation. However, the research indicates it's a lot less influential than you might think, that people aren't born yesterday, but it exists. So it's a real problem. But if you're giving yourself a mandate of saying, we're only going to police disinformation, it's kind of like, so you've given yourself limitless power is what you're saying, because that's the ability to decide what is true. So when Mark Zuckerberg talked about, we don't want Facebook to be the arbiters of truth. And I was like, yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Like, this is sound epistemology right here. Like that would be terrifying. And it was amazing how people like blasted him for like, oh, doesn't want to be arbiter of truth. It's like, yes, he doesn't want to be God Emperor of Dune either. Like this is a terrible idea. And so one of the thing that interferes with our ability to police disinformation is the fact that none of us are omniscient, but an awful lot of us think we are. And that's one of the great realizations. I still haven't bothered to look it up who actually said this, because Yuval Harari in *Sapiens* talks about this other thinker who labeled, he thought it would be better to have called the Enlightenment the discovery of ignorance. That essentially it really was about, all these intuitions we have about, I don't know, how fast things fall, or, where our center place in the universe, like they all made perfect sense to us. And it was really clear. It was really obvious to us we were right. And we're wrong about all sorts of them. And that's just the way human brains work. There's a limit to how much we can know. There's a limit to how much it is knowable. And so like this idea that you can have a perfect, way of policing disinformation it's an excuse for potentially taking on way too much power. Now, I am curious how they do it, nervous about the idea. Can I think it could be done in a somewhat constructive way? I, for example, didn't particularly mind. I actually thought that sometimes social media doesn't get some credit where it was deserved. So for one, when Twitter doubled the number of characters you could use, that was a change for the better. Going to 280, you could actually make a somewhat better point in 280 than 140. I also thought that some of the times that they had, this claim is disputed, as opposed to just what they tried that instead, was definitely healthier. It puts human autonomy back into the equation. So there's good ways you can do this, and there's bad ways you can do it. And unfortunately, when a tool like that is in people in power, they tend to use it for ends they usually think they're achieving a good thing. But that's why you always have to have a check on power. Like the First Amendment is a check on power.
I've always thought that Mark Zuckerberg's argument of the solution to bad speech is not shut it down, is good speech. To drown out the bad with the good, to always, because you can always show the better stuff, show your facts, show your arguments, and then you'll get most people, not all.
I go even slightly farther than that, which is just that, and this is my philosophy of freedom of speech. I call it the lab and the looking glass theory, which is more expansive even than the marketplace of ideas. But it's just, it's another way of saying a humanist argument. It's always important to know what people really think and why. Full stop. And this is the way I feel like academia has taught us to argue. I'm reading this absolutely maddening book by Michael Berube and I think Jennifer Ruth at the moment, that's all about questioning academic freedom, because there's some things that we know so well they shouldn't even be protected by academic freedom anymore. So my whole lab and looking glass idea is that this is all about knowing the universe as it is. And if you think you can know the universe as it really is without knowing what people really think, that's not even a well thought out idea.
I like that a lot. You wrote this open letter to Elon Musk recently, advising him on how to support free speech on Twitter. What did you say to him? And I'm curious, did he read it? Did he write back? I have no idea.
Oh, I wasn't really expecting to write back. But I wanted to put it out there. And it turns out I'm glad we did it relatively fast, because people I have such respect for, like Jeffrey Rosen wrote about this. David French had already written about this. Nadine Strawson, former head of the ACLU, came out and said, listen, we don't want the First Amendment to directly bind Twitter. But believe me, there are people out there who want this to be all top-down government, demanding the following things. But if you're going to ban harassment, if you're going to ban incitement, if you're going to talk about threats, then try to tag these onto the standard in the law, because American First Amendment jurisprudence is the longest sustained meditation on how you have freedom of speech in the real world, with some of the greatest minds in American thinking. I mean, Oliver Wendell Holmes from Brandeis, Justice Robert Jackson, Brennan, Thurgood Marshall. These are heavyweights when it comes to thinking about how you make this happen in the real world. So we make the argument, if you want to limit it to certain kinds of content, by all means, you as long as you're clear about that, you can do that. But if you're going to be policing these things by trying to tie it to an outside standard, you make it less capable of being arbitrary. But also, I made the argument about the disconfirmation, that essentially systems of disconfirmation can potentially be something that could be a real boon to the human race if we learned how to use them somewhat better. So don't give up on that part. So that was my initial way of getting through it. And of course, when I talk to Haidt about it, he's always talking about how to structure it better. But it's really cool that you already have a lot of insights and very consistent with human nature that could actually work at your site.
Very good. Do you think he's going to be successful?
Don't know. I try to practice the epistemic humility I preach,
Good.
and truth is, I don't know. But here's actually the thing that I found the most disturbing about this whole discussion. He got everyone's ire on Twitter because he mentioned free speech, and I listen to NPR every morning, and every time they talk about this, they're always saying, "Well, this means that it might return a torrent of hate speech." And every time they talk about this, they talk about hate speech. And I'm like, okay, so you know that they've been trying to clamp down on hate speech on campus since the 1980s. It became the excuse for limiting free speech in the 1980s. It led to the speech codes of the 1980s. And look at the people who get in trouble on campus. I rarely see it actually used against anything that any sensible person would actually call hate speech. It's usually like an op-ed that someone didn't like, that it has nothing even to do with race or sex in some cases. It's routinely abused, as any First Amendment person will tell you. Of course, it's going to be routinely abused because people are people, and that's why you limit their power to oversee what other people are allowed to say. So like this unreflective kind of like free speech equals hate speech, therefore free speech bad. I have never seen such a raw expression of that as I've seen since the New York Times came out and said cancel culture is real, and that people are scared of talking, and had a couple like fairly sensible arguments about articles about chilled speech, and then when Elon Musk comes out, like there definitely is this long kind of process of trying to make free speech like I thought someone joked is like trying to make free speech the new F word is surprisingly effective for a young, mostly upper class, highly educated demographic.
And that actually that tees up what I was going to ask quite well, because when I kind of look at the landscape today, we have folks on the right trying to legislate against certain kinds of content. Example, critical race theory.
Yeah.
We have folks on the left.
The worst law by way on that is actually in Florida, but people have been talking about the K through 12 one. The DeSantis actually has a whole law that applies to higher ed. The K through 12 ones, legally speaking, they might actually be constitutional, no matter how unwise they are. The ones that apply to higher ed are not.
And then, of course, you have the left with their own set of rules in higher ed. And what I'm wondering is this a temporary blip, or is this part of a longer trend where people are being conditioned to accept restrictions on their civil liberties?
That's a great question. I tend to also be with Haidt, unfortunately. I call myself a temperamental optimist in a pessimistic world. I think that things are going to get worse before they get better. I think that the combination of a more conservative Supreme Court, but also partially due to the fact that the inability to get Merrick Garland on the court, that undermines people's faith in the system. I think we're headed into a very disruptive 10-year period. And I'm not totally sure where we're going to be at the end of that. The funny thing is, though, as the culture war gets nastier, and I fear it's going to get even nastier, which is kind of amazing, thinking about like 2 years ago, but I think it's probably going to get worse. The rules of the road get more important under those circumstances, not less. So freedom of speech being something that protects both liberals and conservatives, and you should be happy for it, is something that people should appreciate. But watching, some of these laws throw free speech out when it's, about CRT in higher education, where this is unquestionably unconstitutional. But then also reading this book by, one of the heads of the American Association of University Professors basically saying, we had freedom of speech back in the 60s when we weren't very powerful, but now our ideas are really popular. So let's close the door behind us, and kind of almost owning that idea. And I'm like, we're headed in a bad direction. Meanwhile, I feel like the evidence in the real world for free speech working is getting better, not weaker. Usually people don't think of this in terms of free speech, but I do. The improvement in the safety of surgery. A big reason why that's happened is because we've taught people in the operating room that you have to listen to everybody who dissents, and that catches errors. Same thing, very similar thing happening in airlines. That essentially there are incredible records in part because we taught everybody say, if you see something like you are empowered to say something. There are so many different ways in which we're showing the importance of the role of dissent, but partially because we're pulling away from each other in this, battle of all versus all in the culture war. Free speech is going to need neutral defenders now more than ever.
You and Jonathan have a bunch of recommendations in your book, The Coddling of the American Mind, on how people can resist the urge to protect people from harm when it comes to words. What are some of these recommendations that we can do? Because this sounds pretty scary, but there's got to be stuff that we can do to do better. Yeah, what are some
Well,
of those?
I think that one of the things that I talk about, is thinking about cognitive distortions, these mental exaggerations that anxious and depressed people make in their heads. They're very similar to logical fallacies, like catastrophizing, binary thinking, mind reading. All of these things that you should know rationally you can't actually do are things that depressed and anxious people come to believe everything's all or nothing. The world's going to end if this date doesn't go well. They're all habits that if you really believe them, and I say this as someone who, came close to killing himself, which is what led to Coddling the American Mind, addressing those voices in your head through rationality actually can make a huge difference if you turn that into a habit. Now, if you turn those arguments outward, though, don't catastrophize, don't engage in binary arguments, don't assume that you know what someone is actually thinking or feeling, those are good arguments for arguing, period. I do think that you have to really take head on the idea that people are not resilient and that they'll be permanently harmed by words. The evidence is not good. It's not strong that actually is true. And the only way that you can make it true is if you make someone really believe that they will be harmed by this. You can turn it into a self-fulfilling prophecy, but that's a really cruel thing to do. I think one of the most interesting things that could be done that would help higher ed a lot, and particularly the young people going there, would be if they didn't go straight to college. Like if you had a situation where people were not doing another year of studying, like going and working somewhere, having some life experiences so they could develop a sense of autonomy and a self-efficacy, I think this does tend to put a lot of these battles on campus in perspective and about the idea of your fragility or the people next to your fragility. I mean, I started working when I was little, but when I got to Stanford for law school, it was just like I couldn't believe like how stressed out some of my classmates were, and there was this major divide. Like those of us who had careers or worked a lot before law school were like, "This is great. This place is a spa. I love it." And then people who'd come straight through school who were just constantly like stressed out because they just weren't used to it. So I think a little bit of maturity would help that way. But I do think that if I could wave a magic wand, I would have everybody in their junior year of high school be required to do one semester debate where they have to take the opposite point of view from what they really think.
Yeah.
Because once you get in the habit of doing that, you start realizing, oh, I guess now that I just convinced myself of the obvious, I guess people who disagree with me aren't necessarily all, evil or stupid.
Yeah.
So I think there are a lot of things we can do, and unfortunately, we're doing close to none of them.
I love those recommendations. Sorry, Dan, I'll just throw in one comment. The point
Yeah.
about almost doing a gap year before university, one of my really good friends in high school was a Mormon. And so Mormons routinely, I think after high school, take 2 years to do a service trip and basically spread the gospel of their church. So regardless of what you think about religion or not, I think it's interesting that they're doing this. They take 2 years, and he came back. He was always more mature, but I mean, really like ready, like, okay, I'm ready for the world, get married, have kids, go to school, do very well, very, very focused, very driven, but very nice. Interesting that this is sort of one of your recommendations. I like that.
Yeah, no, I was going to say if you want to make anybody psychologically resistant, have them work at a Sparrow. Because I'll tell you, man, I worked in food service and people are nasty.
Yeah.
You know?
You know how they get that brass all shiny? They have the underage kids and the people who aren't legally working there, up till 3 o'clock at night polishing that stuff. And I, like my best friend, who was still one of my friends to this day, he was tough enough to keep it up. And I'm like, I'm out. Like I'm not polishing your brass until 3 a.m. anymore. And then I had better jobs after that.
Yeah, my oldest, I had him get a job at a pizza place, and he had like a plastic knife thrown at him. I mean, all assortments. My daughter is 15 now. She's getting a job bagging groceries, which was my first job. And again, it's kind of like I really think you ought to work a surface job where you just get beat up, because that will add some perspective.
Burlington Coat Factory was definitely, and I mean, and that definitely gave me, insight into very different lives than my own, I learned a lot from that. And if I could give someone kind of like an ideal job for them to take before college, just going and working a regular job in some part of the country that's nothing like the one you grew up in, I think that would be incredibly healthy for us. And it was very strange. Like we are more divided in terms of where we physically live in terms of politics, like that kind of polarization has gotten worse, but also in terms of economic class. We are more segregated in terms of class and economics than we were 30 years ago by a lot. And I think that it leads to this kind of narrow way of thinking that can lead to catastrophizing and all these other aspects of polarization that don't seem to be getting much better.
By the way, Greg, before you mentioned a very personal anecdote, it looks like you had a mental health crisis a few years ago.
I just threw that in there. I've gotten so used to talking about it.
I didn't
time I tried to kill myself. Yeah, so no biggie.
I didn't want to brush over that. I also didn't want to pry or go deep into it. But it sounds like it was the impetus for writing this book. And I know we're over time, but if you want to, you can go into, I'm just curious, what is it that you learned out of that changed you so much to write this pretty impressive book?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. So I started working at Fire in 2001. I was hired to be the first legal director. I became president in 2005, and I moved to Philadelphia, where I don't have a lot of friends. And there's something about Philly, we don't agree with each other. Philly doesn't like me, and I feel very lonely there. And I also have this kind of rule that you have to have some amount of, when you're the boss, you have to have some separation from you and staff, not because you'll find people you don't like and you might get rid of a good employee, but also because you tend to favor some people, even no matter if they're good for the organization. So I was very lonely. I was having a very bad year, and I always had these bouts of depression. But this time I went to go buy the stuff to kill myself, kind of like bad depression. I called 911 when I realized what I was thinking. And I got myself checked in and got held for a couple of days up in northern Philadelphia. And I didn't think I'd ever be okay again. Meanwhile, my staff didn't even know that this happened. It was on a 3-day weekend. I just kind of called out right before I got, checked in, and they could only hold you for 3 days, and moved back to New York City. That helped by itself because I have great friends there and I'm much happier there. And to be clear, when you're that far gone, medication, all this kind of stuff like CBT, it's too late for CBT to help you when you're in acute phase. But then I started doing CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, and over time, I've reached a point where I don't even have those bouts anymore. And I always had them. So while I was learning not to catastrophize, not to engage in binary thinking, not to engage in emotional reasoning, not to overgeneralize, I was watching what was going on campus, being like, it's like administrators are saying, do overgeneralize, do engage in emotional reasoning, do catastrophize. But thank goodness the students aren't actually listening. And then when I started seeing all of this medicalized kind of idea of we need censorship because I'll be permanently harmed by these words, or actually usually it's I won't be harmed by these words, but this person over here will be harmed. I was like, wow, this is just completely the wrong way to think about this. So that's when I approached Haidt about this goofy idea I had about the connection between censorship and CBT, that essentially the same habits that will make you anxious, that will make you a censor, can also make you anxious and depressed. And so we wrote this article in 2015. Everyone on my staff thought it was a dumb idea. Haidt loved it and wrote this article. It became a very popular article on The Atlantic, but we didn't have the data yet. We were hearing from campuses that there was also this mental health crisis, but the data wasn't in yet. And so I was confident it was happening. He wasn't so sure. And then as soon as the data started coming in for how bad it had gotten, that thing that we experienced, that something really seriously had changed right at the end of 2013 through 2014, it came out entirely and then some in the numbers. So that's why we started working together. So my whole path on this was, the idea that something good could have come out of me being hospitalized as a danger to myself. It's rewarding. And when people to this day still contact me just to say, I read Coddling the American Mind, I'm in a similar state. And I even have this whole kind of are you currently, a danger to yourself? Are you having suicidal ideations? I have this whole spiel that I go through, but it is one of the most rewarding parts of being honest about that.
Amazing, Greg. That first of all, I'm really happy to see that you're much better, that something really positive came out of this. That's incredible. And having had family members that have gone through major depressive disorder and some of these things, the stuff sucks. It's very, very tough to solve. How cool that you've built something really good out of this that could help a lot of other people. So for those of you listening, I've read the Coddling of the American Mind. All of the things that Greg mentioned will be in the resources section. Check it out. I think it makes you feel more positive. It makes you see the world the way it is, not the way that you think it is, which is what this is all about. So this is fantastic.
Oh, thanks. Thanks for having me. And check us out at thefire.org. We're doing a big public education campaign about freedom of speech and why it's so precious and important.